my name is Hope Houston, and you're listening to Kinda Sorta Brown with University of Chicago's Public Policy Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Kinda Sorta Brown. I'm your host, Chase Leto, and I'm here with
Lena. Hey, y'all.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to this season of KSB, the Community, Unity, and Unrest. So a lot has been going on in our country and even right here in Illinois these past couple of weeks. Among all of the unsettling events, we finally heard some good news this week with the end of cash money bail, making Illinois the first state to make such an incredible push forward. I want to shout out the Chicago Community Bond Fund, the Coalition to End Money Bail, and all of the organizers across the state who have worked tirelessly to make sure this important legislation passed. Now, it's just after Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and on this day, you can always count on people to remind us of the work he contributed to racial justice, his peaceful ways of bringing about change, and rhetoric that minimizes just how much of a radical he truly was. Something that many people seem to forget on this day is how MLK and so many other Black leaders during this time, and even today, were constantly under surveillance by police and the FBI. How government officials conspired to kill or incarcerate Black leaders fighting for our right, and the rise of policing and the carceral system beginning even before this time period. Thinking about that time period paired with the rise in police violence that we've been witnessing over the last few years, it is very unsettling to me to know that much of the problems that the organizers, activists, and community leaders faced before us have only gotten worse due to racism being viewed more as an individual problem rather than an institutional problem, while the mechanisms that perpetuate this institutional racism have only become more widespread and invisible over time. Today, on this episode of KSB, we won't be debating whether the police actually keep communities safe, because we know they do not keep us all safe. Nor will we be debating reform versus abolition, because we know that reform has historically resulted in the expansion, not the contraction, of the police system. For this episode of KSB, we will be discussing how policing has failed to address the real issues going on within communities, how policing affects communities differently, how alternatives to policing, often discussed, cause more harm to communities, how we can reimagine what justice should look like, and how communities have built and nourished collective power to make their vision of justice a reality. But before we get to that, I really want to talk about what happened at the Capitol. Lena, I know you had a lot of thoughts about that.
Exactly, Chase. And what we saw just a few days into 2021 was not a surprise. It did not come out of nowhere, and what we saw was, to say the least, domestic terrorism. What we saw was white power that was seated too comfortably in our nation, and has been, for a matter of fact. People who felt encouraged to do this by 45 were motivated by something greater. They are motivated and backed by the inherent history and system of this country that treated them and consistently upholded white power and supremacy. A stark contrast to the violence faced and experienced by peaceful Black and Indigenous people in this past summer that we saw, being brutalized and surviving the torture that police and the militarization of police cause. As always, there's always work to be done, and we saw that on the 6th of January. Today, in this episode of Policing, like Chase mentioned, not only will we focus on the system itself, but more importantly, reimagining the possibilities outside of that with communities on how we can keep ourselves safe.
And though more people are just beginning to look at the carceral system differently, there is a much larger history of prison abolition and the tradition of reimagining justice and safety within our communities. Today, Lena and I hope to honor that history by pushing you all to think about what justice looks like outside of violence and outside of the carceral state, how we can center healing rather than punishment, and how safety can be found through collective community. Throughout the episode, we'll hear from you, our listeners, about what your vision of justice and safety is, and how you find strength through community power. Today, we'll also hear from Alycia Kamil, a healer and organizer with Good Kids Mad City Chicago. But before we get into that, let's get into the Melanin Archives. Let's dig into the Melanin Archives.
Who is being policed? What element of history represents policing in your mind?
I would have to say that the communities that are policed heavily are, of course, non-white communities, and this stems from a hundreds of years of racialized capitalism and how that system has in turn created these negative stereotypes against non-white citizens, which has caused a fear, therefore making them the more over-policed population.
Everyone's being policed, but specifically marginalized communities are the ones being policed. And we see this not just in our justice system. We see this in our schools. We see this in how we're educated. We see this in how, specifically Black people and other Black and Indigenous people of color interact with the other world and how the rest of the world interacts with us.
On August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown, a young Black teenager from Ferguson, Missouri, was shot and killed by a white police officer who had grabbed him by the neck, threatened him, and shot at him as he tried to escape. Michael was unarmed and was just on his way home with his friend Dorian Johnson when they were stopped by the police officer, not knowing that altercation would be the final moment of his life. The premature death of Michael Brown not only resulted in uprisings across the country and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement on a national scale, but it also shed light on the ways in which the Ferguson Police Department was routinely violating the constitutional rights of Black and Brown residents in the community they were supposed to, quote-unquote, protect and serve. Since municipal tax revenue is heavily limited in St. Louis County, city officials began relying heavily on municipal fines to fill up the gap in money, resulting in the systematic incentivizing of police crackdown on the most minor of offenses, from traffic stops to loitering. This increase in law enforcement disproportionately affected the poor Black residents in Ferguson because police officers not only stopped them more often for traffic violations, but also, if you didn't pay your fine, a warrant was out for your arrest. City officials not only exploited the residents of Ferguson for monetary gain, but purposefully heightened the presence of police in their community not to protect them, but to ensure that the exploitation was carried out consistently. This brings me to question what the real purpose of police and the carceral system is. We've seen time and again that the police do not keep us safe, but further perpetuate violence within our communities. We will take a deeper look into the disruption police cause within communities, as well as how communities have risen up to prevent this harm in the KST.
KST. It's piping hot.
What do you think of when you see a prison?
The image of a prison is not something that is hard to imagine, especially as a Black and Brown individual in Black and Brown communities and low-income communities, because it's something that they see every day when they walk into their schools or they just simply exist outside of their home. It's not something they have to think of or try to create in their mind because it's all around them all the time. We see police officers constantly standing at every door of a building that we go into. We see the lack of resources, no windows, etc. It's not something that we have to think of or imagine because it's around us all the time.
Prison is truly just the height of policed world that we live in today, especially in the United States. It's the height of the fears of misunderstanding. It's the height of the fears of stereotypes put against marginalized communities. It's just a tool utilized to control populations, and it's not something that's used to redefine people or help people move on to a better life or whatever. It is simply a mode of controlling populations.
Violence cannot heal or adequately respond to violence. This was said by Damon Williams, the co-founder of the Let Us Breathe collective right here in Chicago. When thinking about how policing has historically failed communities of color, I often think about this quote that Damon said because of the ways in which policing, at least in the ways that we think of it at first sight, policing is supposed to be a response to violence. It's supposed to be a way to seek justice, a way to heal from a traumatic experience that we might have gone through. But in reality, policing and the carceral system has only resulted in more violence. It hasn't been able to address many of the problems that it's been called on to address, from housing to joblessness to lack of educational equities and a lot of other problems that it's called on to address. And thinking about the ways in which policing has only caused more violence instead of been a response, an adequate response to violence, I just want to ask Lena, how has policing historically failed communities of color? How are police officers disruptors to communities? And how does the carceral system impact the communities that people who experience incarceration are removed from?
I think that that's a completely loaded question, because when I think about policing in its we're thinking about policing in its historic beginnings form. It was built to represent violence. It was built to suppress, and it was built in light of anti-Blackness, anti-people of color now. And I think that framing of it being anti an entire community of people, then you're seeing that, of course, it makes sense that they're failing communities of color today, because they were never built to protect, but they were actually built to harm. And I think for me, when I'm thinking about this goes into disrupting communities, whether it be prisons that are built in hearts of communities, policing and legislation coming in with nobody who's from that community, who's there advocating for what that community actually needs, but rather having an outsider come in and saying what needs to be done. This is all what the police system in the state represents. And to me, again, kind of what we started in the introduction, this isn't a conversation of who's being policed, but rather this is already happening and the system is there, and how can we keep communities safe? Because right now it's this intentional act of a state that is truly doing the job that they intended to do. They were created and made to come in and really just incite violence. So when people say that they're not doing their job, it kind of irks me, and I don't know if it irks you, Chase, but I'm like, no, they're doing exactly what they're told to do, and that's why they're getting more funding, that's why they're being supported, is because people know that the state is doing what the state meant to do from its very beginning. When they started this entire policing to be slave catchers, and that's exactly how it is now. And I think that that's something that really just baffles my mind, is when the conversation starts on the idea of how to decrease policing, when in reality it's entirely made to hurt a community. So why should it exist in the first place?
I really like a lot of what you were saying about how it's designed to do exactly what it is doing, because a lot of people don't really think about that. A lot of people think that police are here to protect us. Police are here to respond to violence. Police are here to provide safety. Those things can be true, but they're only true for certain people, specifically for white people and white property. There's even the rhetoric that policing serves to address all of these different issues, from mental illness to, harassment to theft. And a lot of that just simply isn't the case. And to me, there's this rhetoric that even those who oppose policing think that policing rose as a result of the war on crime and the war on poverty and, recently the war on terror, when in reality, the rising of policing started before then. It started in the 1940s and 1950s and was occurring at the same time you had Black, Indigenous, and Latina communities beginning to rise up and trying to call attention to the institutional and interpersonal barriers preventing them from having the political and economic autonomy to have a voice in our country. To me, this is not a coincidence, but an ongoing